Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world, because this is one of those stories that feels even heavier in the quiet hours, when the house is still, the past feels close, and old memories seem to breathe through the walls. When Eleanor Whittemore looked at the faded blue house at the end of Hawthorne Lane, she never saw wood, nails, or property value. She saw winters survived, bills somehow paid, fevers broken before dawn, and the ghosts of ordinary days that had once felt impossible to get through, and yet had become the very proof that she had lived. The white trim needed repainting again, the porch steps creaked more than they should, and the climbing roses along the fence had grown too wild without Daniel to trim them properly. But to Eleanor, the house was still beautiful. It had not been built with wealth. It had been built with endurance. 40 years earlier, when she and her husband first moved to that small coastal town in Maine, they had almost nothing. Daniel Whittemore had worked with his hands, picking up whatever honest labor he could find: dock repairs, carpentry jobs, roofing in the warmer months, furnace maintenance when the weather turned bitter. Eleanor had worked part-time at the public library before the children came, then at a pharmacy counter, then later at the hospital front desk. Their life had never been easy, but in those first years, it had still felt like theirs. "We'll do one room at a time," Daniel had told her when they first stood on the patch of land they could barely afford. He had placed one rough hand on the back of her neck and looked out at the open lot as if he could already see the future standing there. "It doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be ours." Eleanor had laughed then, younger and less tired, her hair pinned up loosely against the ocean wind. "One room at a time," she had said. "At that rate, we'll have grandchildren before we have a proper kitchen. Then our grandchildren will know exactly who built it." And in a way, that was what happened. Not the grandchildren, those came much later, and not in the way she had once imagined, but the truth of his words. Every inch of the house carried fingerprints of sacrifice. Daniel laid flooring in the evenings after working full days elsewhere. Eleanor scrubbed salvaged windows until her hands turned raw. When they could not afford cabinets, Daniel built them. When they could not afford curtains, Eleanor sewed them from discounted fabric. The house rose slowly, honestly, without shortcuts. Then the boys came. Richard first, solemn and sharp-eyed even as a child. Thomas, 2 years later, loud and restless from the beginning. Evan last, soft-faced, born after a pregnancy Eleanor had nearly lost. 3 boys in 6 years. 3 appetites. 3 school schedules, 3 futures she and Daniel promised themselves would not be as hard as their own. For a while, life moved the way family life always does: messy, noisy, too fast to appreciate while it is happening. Eleanor packed lunches before sunrise. Daniel taught the boys how to throw a baseball in the backyard. Christmases were modest, birthdays homemade, summers sticky with lemonade and scraped knees and beach towels hanging from the line. There were arguments over chores, tears over report cards, muddy boots by the door, and casseroles stretched farther than they should have gone. Then Daniel died. It happened on a gray November morning so ordinary that Eleanor later hated the date for how ordinary it had dared to be. He had complained of chest tightness the night before, but brushed it off as indigestion. By the time the ambulance came, the boys were crying, the neighbors were standing in the yard, and Eleanor already knew from the expression on the paramedic's face that her life had split into 2. Richard was 14, Thomas was 12, Evan had just turned 8. For months after the funeral, Eleanor moved like someone walking through freezing water. She could not afford to collapse, so she did what women like her had always done. She kept going. She sold the gold bracelet her mother had left her. She canceled the small life insurance plan they'd once meant to upgrade, and stretched what little payout there was across mortgage payments and groceries. She took evening shifts at the hospital after working mornings at the pharmacy, until a supervisor finally offered her a full-time receptionist position because, as he told her, "You're already doing the work of 2 people." There were winters when the heat stayed lower than it should have. There were dinners where she told the boys she was not hungry, even though she was. There were school forms she signed with a smile she did not feel, pretending the overdue notices in her handbag were not multiplying. She learned how to unclog drains, patch drywall, negotiate with utility companies, and cry only in the shower, where no one could hear. One evening, when Richard was in high school and already speaking in that careful, precise way that made teachers adore him, he found her at the kitchen table surrounded by bills. "You should go to bed, Mom," he said. "It's after midnight." She looked up, startled, wiping her eyes before he could pretend not to notice. "I will in a minute." He glanced at the envelopes. "Is it bad?" Eleanor gave the answer mothers have given since the beginning of time. "No worse than usual." Richard did not smile. He rarely did, even then. "I'll get a scholarship," he said. "I won't make it harder." Something inside her broke and healed at the same time. "You are not what makes life hard," she told him. "You boys are the reason I get up in the morning." Thomas had been different. Thomas carried his grief like a lit match, quick to flare, quick to burn. He fought in school once after another boy made a joke about Daniel being dead. He slammed doors, skipped chores, cursed too young, then cried in shame when Eleanor punished him. But he was also the boy who once tried to fix the broken washing machine with a wrench and blind confidence because he had heard her on the phone saying they could not afford a new one. The machine flooded the laundry room. Thomas stood ankle-deep in water, horrified. "I was trying to help," he muttered, his face red. Eleanor had nearly laughed through her exhaustion. "Then next time," she said, handing him a mop, "help with less destruction." And Evan, sweet, impulsive, endlessly affectionate Evan, had taken to sleeping in her bed for almost a year after Daniel died. He would curl against her side and whisper questions into the darkness she could never fully answer. "Do you still talk to Dad?" "In my head, sometimes." "Does he answer?" She stared at the ceiling, her throat aching. "Not with words." "Then how?" "With the things he taught me," she said softly. "Sometimes that's how people stay." The years moved. They always do, even when people swear they cannot bear another day. Richard became the kind of young man guidance counselors pointed to with pride, disciplined, articulate, destined for something bigger than Hawthorne Lane. Thomas grew broad-shouldered and skilled with tools, sometimes rebellious but undeniably capable. Evan, younger and less certain, drifted more than the others, but he had a tenderness that made people forgive him too easily. Eleanor sent Richard to college with money she did not have. She helped Thomas through trade school after he nearly quit twice. She paid Evan's community college fees for 3 semesters before he changed direction again. Every achievement they had was tied, invisibly, to some sacrifice she had made in silence. A missed dental appointment, a second-hand winter coat, a postponement of roof repairs, a private humiliation. She never kept score aloud, but the truth lived in her bones. Now, at 72, she moved more slowly through the house, but with a certain ritual dignity. Her mornings still began in the kitchen with tea in Daniel's old mug. She still opened the back curtains to let in the pale Atlantic light. She still ran her hand across the hallway wall, where pencil marks, long painted over, had once measured the boys' heights year after year. On some days, the loneliness felt manageable. On others, it sat beside her like a fourth son, silent, familiar, impossible to ignore. Her eldest, Richard, now a successful corporate lawyer in Boston, visited only a few times a year, always looking polished, expensive, and faintly impatient with the town he had escaped. He kissed her cheek, brought respectable gifts, and asked efficient questions about her prescriptions, insurance, and whether she had considered planning ahead. Thomas lived closer, but his life was unstable in a different way. He worked hard, sometimes too hard, taking contract jobs that paid well one month and nothing the next. He could still be charming, still call her Ma in a way that softened her instantly, but she knew when he was under strain. His eyes darted. His temper shortened. His visits became more frequent whenever money was thin. Evan came and went like weather. He had the warmest hugs, the easiest smile, and the least structure in his life. He always seemed to be starting over. New apartment, new job, new promise. Eleanor loved him fiercely, but lately even that love had begun to tire under the weight of repetition. Still, in the earliest stage of this story, before anything openly ugly had yet happened, Eleanor clung to hope. Not because her sons gave her much reason to, but because mothers of her generation were built to hope longer than was sensible. One cold afternoon in late October, she stood on the porch after carrying in groceries and pressed a hand lightly to her chest, waiting for the strange flutter there to settle. The wind cut through her sweater. Her breath came short for a moment, then steadied. Across the fence, a younger woman from the neighboring house, Clara Bennett, recently moved in with her little daughter, lifted a hand and called out, "Mrs. Whitmore, are you all right?" Eleanor straightened almost at once. "Of course I am, just moving slower than I used to." Clara smiled gently, not fully convinced. "I made too much soup again. I can bring some over later." "You young women always say that. No one ever accidentally makes too much soup." Clara laughed, and the sound startled Eleanor with its warmth. As she stepped back into the house, closing the door against the wind, she had no idea that life was quietly preparing to change around her. For now, the house was still what it had always been, a shelter held together by memory, sacrifice, and a widow's stubborn hands. For now, Eleanor Whitmore was still just a mother telling herself that love, if given enough years, would eventually come home in the right shape. But somewhere beneath that hope, almost too deep to name, another feeling had already begun to stir. The first small, painful understanding that a woman could spend her whole life building a home for others and still one day have to decide who truly deserved to stand inside it. Before loneliness becomes visible, it usually becomes practical first. It arrives disguised as paperwork left on the kitchen counter, as polite questions asked too often, as a son standing in the hallway with concern on his face and calculation somewhere behind it. For Eleanor Whitmore, the first real cracks in the peace of Hawthorne Lane did not begin with shouting. They began with suggestions. Winter came down hard that year. By December, the sky over the coast had turned into a long stretch of dull pewter, and the blue paint on Eleanor's house looked almost gray under the weak afternoon light. The porch railing needed sanding in the spring. One gutter sagged near the corner. Inside, the old furnace clanked awake each morning like a stubborn old man rising from bed. Eleanor heard every sound the house made. After so many years, she could tell the difference between the harmless settling of boards and the first warning of something expensive. She had become slower, that much was true. Climbing the stairs required more care. Carrying laundry left her more tired than before. Some afternoons she needed to sit down in Daniel's old armchair and close her eyes for 10 quiet minutes before finishing the dishes. But she was still managing. She still paid her bills on time. She still cooked her own meals. She still watered the houseplants, folded the blankets, and kept the front walk clear. The house was aging, and so was she, but neither one had surrendered. Richard came first with his version of concern. He arrived from Boston 2 Saturdays before Christmas, wearing a camel wool coat and gloves so fine Eleanor worried to touch them with flour-covered fingers. She had been making meat pies for the freezer when she heard his car pull into the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she saw him step out, check his phone, glance at the bedders, and stand for a second studying the house in a way that made her feel strangely observed. When he came in, he kissed her cheek, accepted coffee, and complimented the smell of the kitchen. But halfway through the first cup, after only a little talk about weather and traffic, he leaned back in his chair and said, in the measured tone he always used when he thought he was being reasonable, "Mom, have you given any more thought to downsizing?"
Eleanor looked at him over the rim of her mug. "Good afternoon to you, too." "I'm serious." "I know you are. That is exactly why it's irritating." Richard gave a faint sigh. At 48, he had Daniel's brow, but none of his softness. Success had sharpened him. Even his silence could feel expensive. "This house is too much for one person now," he said. "It's old, it needs upkeep, and you had that episode with your chest last fall. It was a flutter. It was still something. It was none of your business because I was fine." He pressed his lips together. That's exactly the kind of thing people say before they stop being fine. Eleanor set her mug down more firmly than necessary. "Richard, if you came all the way from Boston to tell me I'm old in my own kitchen, you've wasted gas." For a second, she saw the boy he used to be, the one who hated disappointing her. But the moment passed and a lawyer returned. "There are very nice retirement communities near Portland," he said. "Good care, no stairs, social activities, medical staff nearby. You'd be safer." "And what would happen to this house?" Richard hesitated only a second too long. "It would make sense to sell while the market is favorable." There it was, not crude, not yet, but there all the same. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "Your father built these walls," she said, quietly. "I buried half my life to keep this roof over your heads. I am not handing it to a real estate agent because you discovered market conditions." "I'm trying to be practical." "No," she said. "You're trying to be early." Richard did not raise his voice. He almost never did. But a chill entered the space between them that no furnace could have warmed. He left before dinner, kissing her cheek again as if the conversation had not bruised anything. After he drove away, Eleanor stood at the front window longer than necessary, one hand resting on the curtain, the other on the ache that had settled under her ribs. Not her heart this time, but something older and sadder. Thomas came next, though with him the approach was different. He did not talk about retirement communities or property values, at least not at first. Thomas arrived with a toolbox, a ladder, and the energy of a man who preferred to be useful rather than vulnerable. He noticed things Richard would never notice: the loose board near the back steps, the leak beginning under the upstairs bathroom sink, the fact that one of the basement windows no longer sealed properly. "You should have called me sooner," he muttered, kneeling under the sink while Eleanor stood nearby with a towel. "This pipe's been threatening to go for months." "I didn't want to bother you." Snort. "You think this bothers me? Try dealing with clients who want custom cabinets with discount store budgets." He was still handsome in a rougher way than Richard, broader, more weathered, with dark hair graying at the temples before its time. But strain clung to him now. Eleanor could see it in the shadow beneath his eyes, and the quickness with which irritation found him. When the leak was fixed and the steps reinforced, she made him grilled cheese and tomato soup, the meal he had loved as a boy after wet soccer practices. He ate standing at the counter like he had somewhere else to be, though she suspected he did not. "How's work?" she asked. "Work's work." That means bad. That means complicated. Complicated usually means expensive. He gave her a sideways look and almost smiled. "Still interrogating me the same way?" "Still your mother." He wiped his mouth with a napkin and stared for a moment at the frosted window above the sink. "I had to let one of the guys go," he said at last. "Job fell through, client backed out, materials already ordered." "I'm sorry." "Yeah," he exhaled. "I'll sort it." She knew that tone. Pride struggling not to sound frightened. He came 3 more times that month, once to check the furnace, once to salt the path after a storm, once with no clear reason at all except to sit at her kitchen table and complain about permits, payments, and a truck repair he could not afford. Eleanor listened, offered pie, and let the conversation drift where it wanted. But by the 3rd visit, she sensed something beneath the helpfulness, a circling thought he had not yet spoken. He finally said it in January. They were in the living room, the television low, snow moving sideways past the front windows. Thomas had just finished replacing a faulty switch in the hallway. "You know," he said, lowering himself into Daniel's armchair without asking, "this place would be easier if someone fixed it properly. Not little repairs. I mean really fixed it up." Eleanor kept her eyes on the knitting in her lap. New siding, smarter layout in the kitchen. Maybe open up the back wall, get more light. It has been getting light just fine since 1987. He laughed once, then leaned forward. "I'm serious, Ma. This house is worth more than you think if it's done right." There it was again. Different language, same hunger. She raised her head slowly. "Why are my sons suddenly speaking about my house like they're at auction?" Thomas's expression tightened. "No one's talking about an auction." "No? Then why do I keep hearing numbers in everyone's voice?" He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I'm just saying when the time comes." She set the knitting aside. "Do not finish that sentence." He looked at her, caught between shame and defensiveness. "I didn't mean it like that." "You did. Maybe not cruelly, but you did." He stood too quickly, offended now that the truth had been named. "I'm trying to help." "And I am still alive," she said. Thomas left not long after, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the framed photographs in the hallway. Eleanor stared at those photographs for a long time after the house went quiet again. 3 school portraits, 3 graduations, 3 boys in borrowed Easter suits. She remembered broken shoes she had glued back together, fevers she had sat through, the year Richard needed glasses, Thomas needed braces, and Evan needed a tutor, all at once. She remembered how impossible it had all seemed, and how somehow impossible things had become her specialty. Evan, when his turn came, did not arrive with plans or caution. He arrived with a duffel bag. It was late February, sleeting, the kind of raw coastal evening that made the whole world look soaked through. Eleanor had just latched the back door when she heard the knock at the front. Evan stood there with wet hair, red cheeks, and that familiar expression that always mixed embarrassment with hope. "Hey, Mom." She looked at the bag first. "What happened?" He gave a helpless little shrug. "Lease issue." "Lease issue?" "My roommate's brother moved back. It got messy." "Messy enough that you were on my porch with all your clothes." "Not all," he said, "just the important ones." Despite herself, she almost smiled. Then she saw how tired he looked. He was 42 now, but in certain light she could still see the little boy who used to ask whether the dead could answer back. Evan had not become hard in the way his brothers had, but life had not made him steady either. Jobs came and went, plans changed shape. He was good with people, bad with routine, generous with promises, and far too trusting of second chances, including his own. "Come in before you freeze," she said. He hugged her too tightly in the hallway. "You're the best." "That remains to be seen." For a week, he was easy to have around. He shoveled without being asked, made coffee in the mornings, fixed a jammed cabinet drawer, and entertained her with stories from places he should probably have left sooner than he did. At dinner, he was warm, funny, almost boyish. But by the 2nd week, the old pattern returned. He slept late, he left plates in the sink, he talked about job interviews more than he attended them. He began speaking of the house as if his presence there were the most natural thing in the world. One evening, while Eleanor was sorting medication at the table, he leaned in the doorway and said, "You know, I've always thought this place made the most sense for me." She looked up sharply. "What place?" "The house." "No." He blinked. "No what?" "No to whatever sentence comes after that." Evan frowned, wounded. "I wasn't asking for anything. You were walking toward it." He stepped into the room. "Mom, I'm just saying I've always been the one who actually likes it here. Liking this house and deserving to speak of it as yours are two different things." His jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that?" "I think," Eleanor said, more tired than angry, "that all three of my sons are beginning to talk around me as if I am a hallway they are already passing through." The words landed harder than she meant them to. Evan went quiet. For once, he had nothing charming to say. Outside the family, life offered a gentler rhythm. Clara Bennett, the woman next door, had become a steady and unexpected presence. She was in her mid-30s, recently divorced, raising 8-year-old Sophie on her own, and possessed the kind of practical kindness that never announced itself. She brought over soup after storms, yes, but she also noticed when Eleanor's trash bin was too heavy and took it to the curb without asking. She replaced the dead porch bulb one evening when she found Eleanor standing beneath it with a chair and a dangerous amount of confidence. "Oh no," Clara had said, hurrying across the yard. "Absolutely not." Eleanor, 1 foot already on the chair, had bristled. "I've changed light bulbs since before you were born. And now you've earned the right to retire from the activity." Sophie liked to come by with drawings, all sunshine and oversized dogs and houses with smoke curling from chimneys. Once, she handed Eleanor a picture of the blue house with flowers bigger than the windows. "That's your house," Sophie said proudly. "It is a bit more flattering than the real thing." "No," the girl replied with total seriousness. "Mine is how it feels." That sentence stayed with Eleanor for days. Then came her birthday dinner. She turned 73 in March. The weather had just begun softening, though winter still lingered in dirty piles along the curb. She almost canceled the family gathering twice, but some old stubbornness made her go through with it. She roasted chicken, baked potatoes, glazed carrots, and even made Daniel's favorite lemon cake, though she had not felt much like celebrating. Perhaps part of her still believed a table could fix what distance had damaged. Richard arrived first, with wine. Thomas came 10 minutes later, already tense. Evan came down the stairs from his room, looking hastily cleaned and overly cheerful. For the first 15 minutes, they managed civility. They spoke of traffic, sports, work, rising costs, and the absurd price of eggs. Eleanor let herself imagine that maybe the strain was mostly in her head. Then Richard mentioned, too casually, that a colleague knew an excellent estate planner in Portland. Thomas looked up at once. For what? For Mom. For the future. Evan gave a short laugh. "You mean for the house." Richard's face cooled. "Everything doesn't have to be reduced to that." "That's rich coming from you," Thomas muttered. Eleanor set down the serving spoon. The room had changed temperature in an instant. "What is that supposed to mean?" Richard asked. "It means you only come down here when paperwork is involved." "And you only come when something's broken," Richard shot back. "Or when you need money." Thomas pushed back from the table. "At least I show up." Evan laughed again, but there was bitterness in it now. "You both show up when there's something to divide." "Don't start," Richard said. "Why not? We all know what this is." Eleanor sat very still as the voices rose, crossed, and sharpened. Her birthday dinner, her kitchen, her house, and the men she had fed from these same plates were now speaking over her as if she had already been reduced to a future tense. No one had shouted yet, but it was coming. She could feel it. And in that terrible, humiliating moment, Eleanor Whitmore understood something she had resisted for months. The house was no longer just where the family's memories lived. It had become the object around which her sons were beginning to reveal themselves. The silence after Eleanor's birthday dinner lasted longer than the shouting itself. For nearly a week, the house felt altered by what had happened in the kitchen. The chairs had been pushed back into place, the dishes had been washed, the lemon cake had gone stale beneath its glass dome, and yet the humiliation of that night remained suspended in the rooms like smoke. Eleanor moved through her mornings with the same routines she had always kept. Tea in Daniel's mug, curtains open to the pale Atlantic light, a slow check of the mail, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. She could no longer pretend that her sons were simply worried in clumsy ways. Their concern had thinned enough for her to see through it. Beneath it sat want, resentment, and entitlement, each wearing a different face. Richard called first, 3 days after the dinner. His voice on the phone was steady, professional, too measured to be sincere. "I think we should put last weekend behind us," he said. "We?" Eleanor replied. "Yes, all of us. Emotions ran high. That is one way to describe your brothers speaking about my death between bites of roasted chicken." He sighed softly, the way he did in courtrooms and boardrooms when trying not to sound annoyed. "No one was speaking about your death." "No? Then what future were you all discussing so passionately?" He was silent for a beat. "I was thinking practically. You were thinking ahead of your manners. I'm trying to avoid a crisis later, and I am trying to avoid one now." He changed strategy, as he always did when one approach failed. "Maybe we should have a family meeting, something calmer, organized." Eleanor almost laughed. "Organized greed is still greed." "Mom," "No, Richard, you may call me next week if you have something to say that is actually about me and not about this house." She hung up before he could answer. Her hand trembled afterward, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar effort of ending a conversation instead of enduring it. Thomas did not call. He arrived. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon in April, cold enough that the windows fogged at the corners. Eleanor had just finished stacking books in Daniel's old workshop, which over the past months she had slowly begun turning into a small reading room for neighborhood children. The space still smelled faintly of sawdust and machine oil, though Clara had helped her scrub the shelves, and Sophie had insisted on choosing a bright woven rug for the floor. When Thomas came in through the back door, damp and irritable, he stopped short when he saw the workshop. "What's all this?" Eleanor kept placing books in a neat stack. "A room." "I can see that. Why are there bean bags in Dad's workshop?" "Because children are more likely to read if they're comfortable." He looked around as if she had vandalized a cathedral. "You're turning this into a playroom?" "A reading room." Thomas frowned. "You didn't mention this." Eleanor turned then and met his eyes. "I didn't realize I needed clearance." He dragged a hand down his face. "That's not what I'm saying." "No," she said, "but it is what you keep meaning." He stepped further into the room, lowering his voice as though civility might hide what was underneath. "Ma, I know things got ugly at dinner. I'm not defending that. But you have to understand where some of this is coming from. That house is the only real asset you've got." She folded her arms. "I am still not an estate." "I'm not saying you are. I'm saying if decisions get made without thinking things through, people get hurt." "Interesting. Which people?" He stared at her. Rain tapped steadily against the small workshop window. Somewhere in the front of the house, the old clock in the hallway marked the quarter hour. "You know I've put time into this place," he said. "Repairs, upkeep, labor. I'm the one who's been here doing things." "You have done some repairs," Eleanor answered, "and I was grateful." "Was?" "Thomas, gratitude is not ownership. I thanked you for fixing a pipe, not staking a claim." His expression hardened. "So that's what you think this is?" "I think," she said carefully, "that every kindness from my sons now arrives with invisible paperwork attached." He gave a bitter laugh. "You always make everything sound crueler than it is." Do I, or do I just say the quiet part aloud? He left angry, though not loudly. With Thomas, the worst moments were often the ones where he held himself together just enough to seem wounded instead of aggressive. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in the reading room after he was gone, looking at the spines of donated books and feeling more tired than she had in years. But life, when it is kind, does not leave a person alone with disappointment for too long without also sending some small counterweight against it. Clara knocked just before sunset, holding a pot of lentil soup in one hand and Sophie's forgotten sweater in the other. I know this is becoming a suspicious pattern. When Eleanor opened the door, a woman can only make too much soup so many times before it turns into a character flaw. Eleanor let out a small, grateful laugh. Then come in before I accuse you of generosity again. Clara had a way of entering the house without disturbing its dignity. She never took up too much air, never asked questions like a person fishing for personal history, never made Eleanor feel pitied. Sophie trotted behind her, all springy energy and loose shoelaces, and disappeared at once into the workshop reading room to check whether the stack of children's books had grown. Clara noticed Eleanor's face before she sat down. Thomas? Do I look that obvious? You look like someone who has been forced into a conversation she didn't ask for. Eleanor poured tea. That is motherhood in its later years. Clara hesitated, then said gently, You don't have to defend your boundaries to me. That sentence, so simple and so free of performance, touched something raw in Eleanor. For a few moments she said nothing, then, standing at the kitchen counter with the kettle still steaming, she told Clara more than she had told anyone, about the birthday dinner, about the way each son had begun circling the house from a different angle, about the strange shame of hearing children you raised speak as though your life were already transitioning into inventory. Clara listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, she stared down into her tea. I keep asking myself where I went wrong. Clara said, You loved them, she quietly. That's not always being wrong. That's just not always protection. Eleanor looked up. Clara gave a tired little smile. My ex-husband used to say all the right words, too. Sometimes people get very good at sounding loving while arranging the room around their own needs. That night, after Clara and Sophie had gone home, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down 3 names: Richard, Thomas, Evan. She stared at them for a long time. Then beneath each name she wrote not what they had achieved, but what they had become around the subject of the house. It felt brutal. It also felt clarifying. Richard, controlled, persuasive, already pricing the future. Thomas, helpful, resentful, keeping emotional receipts. Evan, affectionate, unstable, assuming access equals devotion. When she reached the end of the page, she turned it over and wrote another name, Clara Bennett. Never asked for anything. The months moved forward. Spring gave way to summer, and the reading room slowly became real. Sophie brought friends. Clara helped paint the shelves a soft cream color. Eleanor, who had once feared her world was shrinking to medication schedules and strained family visits, found herself alive again in strange, beautiful ways. Children sat cross-legged on Daniel's old workshop floor, listening to her read Charlotte's Web and The Secret Garden. Local mothers thanked her. The literacy center she had joined through Clara's encouragement asked if she would help with evening reading sessions for immigrant women. At first, she nearly declined out of habit, that old reflex of making herself small, but then she said yes. One Tuesday in July, after helping a woman from Poland sound out English forms for her nursing certification, Eleanor walked back home feeling something she had not felt in years, usefulness not tied to sacrifice. She was not rescuing grown sons from their chaos, she was simply participating in life.
The sensation steadied her. That was the summer she met with a lawyer, not Richard's colleague, her own. His office was in Portland, tucked above a florist and a travel agency, in a brick building that smelled faintly of paper and old heat. Clara drove her there, not because Eleanor could not take the bus, but because Clara understood that some errands required witness in spirit, even if not in the room. The lawyer, Martin Heller, was silver-haired, discreet, and old enough that Eleanor did not feel patronized by him. He reviewed her current will, listened without visible judgment as she described the family situation, and asked careful questions. "Do you intend to remain in the house for the rest of your life?" he asked. "Yes." "Do you want the right to live there protected regardless of who ultimately inherits?" "Yes." "Do you want to leave it equally to your sons?" Eleanor paused. Through the office window, she could see pedestrians moving along the street below, ordinary strangers carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, each with private griefs and hopes. She thought of Daniel standing on that empty lot 40 years ago, saying, "It just has to be ours." She thought of herself at 36, widowed and exhausted, choosing which bill to pay first. She thought of the birthday dinner. The house no longer felt like a reward to distribute. It felt like the final place where she could still tell the truth. "No," she said. Martin nodded once, as if she had merely selected a legal option and not spoken a heartbreak. Over the next year, the decision matured inside her instead of fading. That mattered. It was not a burst of anger or wounded pride. It was tested by time. Richard kept calling with polite insistence. Thomas came and went in moods. Evan lost another job, found another one, and continued living upstairs longer than either of them had intended. Each son, in his own way, confirmed the pattern rather than breaking it. Then came the final meeting. Richard requested it in a group message that pretended consensus already existed. Thomas agreed at once. Evan, perhaps sensing danger, replied late with a thumbs up and nothing else. Eleanor considered refusing. Then she decided she was done being cornered in fragments. If they wanted clarity, she would give it to them all at once. The meeting took place on a rainy November afternoon, almost 2 years after the birthday dinner. Eleanor asked Clara to take Sophie to the library, not because she needed rescuing, but because she did not want a child in the house when ugliness arrived. Her sons sat in the living room like men waiting for an arbitration hearing. Richard opened with papers in a folder. Thomas had renovation drawings rolled beneath one arm. Evan looked uneasy, but not enough to leave. Eleanor remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of Daniel's old chair. Richard spoke first. "We all agree uncertainty isn't helping anyone." "Do we?" Eleanor asked. He pressed on. "We need to settle what your plan is, especially with the house." Thomas cut in. "If she's staying here, fine, but someone should be lined up to take over maintenance and eventually—" "Eventually what?" Eleanor asked. Neither man answered directly. Evan rubbed his face and muttered, "This is already going badly." Richard drew breath. "Mom, we're trying to prevent conflict." Eleanor looked at the 3 faces she had once bent over in sleep, fever, childhood shame, teenage ambition. Then she looked at the folder, the drawings, the restless expectation. "No," she said, "you are conflict." The room went still. She turned without haste, walked into the hallway, and picked up the ring of house keys from the narrow table beneath the mirror. When she came back, all 3 of them were watching. Richard stood. "What are you doing?" Eleanor's voice, when it came, trembled only on the first word. "You have fought over my house while I am still alive." She walked past them, opened the front door, and looked out across the wet porch just as Clara came up the path, returning alone with an umbrella in one hand. She stopped in surprise when she saw the room behind Eleanor and the tension inside it. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Eleanor stepped onto the porch. "Clara," she said, loud enough for the room behind her to hear clearly,
I need you to take these." And before any of them fully understood what was happening, she placed the house keys into Clara Bennett's stunned, open palm. For one long second after Eleanor placed the keys into Clara Bennett's hand, nobody moved. Rain tapped against the porch railing. The umbrella Clara had been carrying slipped slightly in her grip as she stared down at the metal ring resting in her palm, then back up at Eleanor as though certain she must have misunderstood. Inside the living room, 3 grown men stood frozen in the house their father had built, unable to process what had just happened because none of them had imagined their mother would ever act before explaining herself. Clara was the first to speak, and even then her voice was low with confusion. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Eleanor did not let her finish. Her expression had gone beyond anger into something quieter and far more final. "No," she said, loud enough for the room behind her to hear every word. "I have been mom and ma and mother to men who no longer hear me unless money is involved. So for the next few minutes, I would like to be a person." The sentence hit the room harder than shouting would have. Richard recovered first, as he usually did. He stepped toward the door, folder still in hand, his tone sharpened by disbelief. "This is absurd." Thomas came behind him. "Ma, what the hell are you doing?" Evan said nothing at all. His face had gone pale. Clara, alarmed now and plainly wanting no part in family warfare, tried to hand the keys back. "I can't take these." "Yes, you can, because this is not impulsive, it is not symbolic, and it is not open for debate." Richard stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," Eleanor answered, turning to face all 3 sons again, "that the legal decisions have already been made." The silence that followed did not come from shock alone. This silence came from realization. Thomas looked at Clara as if she had somehow engineered the entire thing. "You've been in on this?" Clara immediately shook her head. "No, I haven't. I had no idea she was going to do this." "That's true," Eleanor said. "She didn't know, because unlike the rest of you, she never asked." Richard's jaw hardened. "You changed your will." "I did more than that." He laughed once without humor. "You can't be serious." Eleanor took one step back into the doorway, as though re-entering the border of her own house with new authority. "I met with a lawyer last year, then again 6 months ago. Then again this autumn. The documents are signed, witnessed, and filed. I have retained the legal right to live in this house for the rest of my life. After my death, this home goes to Clara Bennett." Thomas swore under his breath. Evan finally found his voice. "Mom." "No," Eleanor said, not cruelly but with enough firmness to stop him. "You will all listen now. For once in your lives as men, you will let me finish a sentence in my own home." Something in her tone carried Daniel's old steel. All 3 of them fell quiet. She looked first at Richard. "You tried to dress your greed as concern. You talked about safety, planning, and being practical, but every conversation bent towards selling this house before I was even gone." Then she turned to Thomas. "You used repair work like an investment strategy. Every pipe, every stair, every switch, somewhere in your mind you were counting that labor toward a future claim." Then Evan. That one hurt her the most. It showed on her face. "And you confused access with love. You acted as if staying under my roof automatically made you the son who understood me best." Evan dropped his eyes. Eleanor drew a slow breath. "This woman next door helped me carry groceries in the snow without asking what this house was worth. She replaced porch bulbs, brought soup, drove me to appointments, listened when I was ashamed, and never once behaved as if my death was a timing issue. She did not earn this house because she manipulated me. She earned my trust because she never tried to." Richard's voice came back icy and controlled.
You're making an emotional decision." "No," Eleanor replied. "An emotional decision would have been leaving everything to blood and praying love might grow where character did not. This is the most rational decision I have made in years." Thomas stepped down onto the wet porch, rain dotting his jacket at once. "So that's it? Some neighbor woman walks in and gets what your own sons should have?" Clara flinched. Eleanor did not. "Not what you should have, what you assumed you would have." That afternoon ended in disorder, but not the kind that repeats old patterns. Richard threatened legal review. Thomas shouted twice more before storming off the porch. Evan remained standing in the living room, looking as though the floor beneath him had shifted and might not hold. Clara, still stunned, said very little beyond insisting that she had never wanted to come between a mother and her children. When the house was finally quiet, Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table with trembling hands and felt the first wave of aftermath crash through her. Her heart raced. Her mouth had gone dry. She was not made of iron, no matter how steady she had sounded. Clara brought her water, then tea, then simply sat with her in silence until Eleanor could breathe normally again. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I never wanted—" "I know," Eleanor answered. "I would understand if you changed your mind." Eleanor looked up sharply, and for the first time since the confrontation, a tired smile touched her face. "That is exactly why I won't." The weeks that followed were difficult, but they were not empty. That mattered. Richard moved first, as expected. Within 10 days, Eleanor received a letter from a law office in Boston requesting copies of the relevant estate documents and suggesting, in language polished enough to conceal insult, that she may have acted under undue influence. Eleanor carried the letter to Martin Heller's office herself. Martin adjusted his glasses, read the page once, and gave a dry little snort. "This has your son written all over it. I assume that is not meant as praise." "It is not, but it is also not a threat."
He folded the letter and set it down. "Your documents are airtight. Life estate, transfer on death deed, witnesses with no conflict, capacity notes from your physician. He can contest it, but based on what you've told me, he will lose." Eleanor leaned back slowly. "He actually believes I must have been manipulated." Some people find it easier to imagine corruption than rejection. That sentence steadied her more than any legal guarantee. Richard did file motions, though none gained traction. Each challenge only confirmed the strength of the arrangement. By Christmas, his legal path had narrowed into humiliation. Eleanor heard through a cousin that his wife, Marianne, was furious, not about the lost house, but about the lengths he had gone to pressure his own mother. Thomas fared worse in more visible ways. The contract jobs he had been depending on started to collapse one after another. A client accused him of cutting corners, then another refused payment over delay disputes. What had once seemed like temporary instability hardened into something more serious. He came by only twice that winter, each time tight-jawed and brittle. The first visit was angry. "You've humiliated me," he said in the front hall, refusing coffee. "No," Eleanor answered, "I disappointed you. That is not the same thing." "You made me look like a fool." "You did that yourself when you started counting my house before I was in the ground." He left after 10 minutes, too proud to stay, too wounded not to show up at all. The second visit, 3 months later, was different. He stood on the porch without knocking for nearly a minute before Eleanor opened the door. His shoulders looked heavier somehow. "I got sued," he said. That was all. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in before the neighbors get a free show." He gave a humorless breath that almost qualified as a laugh. At the kitchen table, he admitted more than he had ever admitted before. The business was failing, cash flow was a mess, Pride had made him overpromise, and anger had made him careless. He did not apologize then, not directly, but for the first time he stopped speaking like a claimant and started speaking like a man who had lost control of his life. "I thought if I could just lock one thing down," he said, staring into untouched coffee. "The house?" He nodded once. Eleanor folded her hands. "Then you were not really after a house, Thomas. You were after certainty. But certainty taken from someone else rots in the hand." He absorbed that in silence. It was not redemption, but it was movement. The most complicated transformation belonged to Evan. For weeks after the key handover, he avoided her even while still living upstairs. He left early, came home late, and moved through the house with a hurt stiffness that made Eleanor remember him at 15 after his first real heartbreak. But 42-year-old grief carried other chemicals: embarrassment, resentment, self-pity. Finally, on a raw February evening, she knocked on his door herself. He opened it halfway. "What?" She crossed her arms. "If you intend to punish me with silence in my own home, at least do it downstairs where the heating is better." A flicker of shame crossed his face. He let her in. His room looked like every temporary arrangement he had ever created: clothes half-folded, extension cords snaking across the floor, plans without structure. Eleanor sat on the edge of the desk chair and studied him. He would always have softness in him. That had never been the problem. The problem was that he mistaken softness for maturity. "I know you're angry," she said. "I'm not just angry." "What else?" He looked away. "I thought I mattered more." The honesty of it pierced her. "You do matter, Evan, but not because you can stay in this house forever. That isn't love, Evan. That's shelter." He sat on the bed, shoulders rounded. "I never wanted to hurt you." "No, you just expected me to keep absorbing the consequences of your unfinished life." He swallowed. She saw his eyes redden, though he tried to hide it. After a while, he said, in a voice smaller than she had heard from him in years, "What am I supposed to do now?" And that was the first real opening. Eleanor did not rescue him. She did something harder and more useful. She offered terms. "You find stable work," she said. "You enter the electrician's apprenticeship Mr. Donnelly told you about last year. You stop talking about this house as if it was stolen from you, and you set a date to move into your own place when you can afford it." He stared at her. "And if I don't?" "Then you will learn the same lesson anyway, only colder." Outside those family reckonings, Eleanor's life expanded in ways she had once believed were no longer available to women her age. She increased her hours at the literacy center and began coordinating reading circles twice a month. Clara helped her apply for a small community grant to improve the workshop reading room, and when the grant was approved, they added shelves, proper lamps, and a little painted sign over the door, "The Harbor Room." Children came after school. Women from the literacy classes sometimes stayed for tea. Sophie, now older and sharper-eyed, began calling Eleanor her practice grandmother, which made Clara laugh and Eleanor unexpectedly emotional. In May, Eleanor did something none of her sons would ever have predicted. She took a trip. Not far, not glamorous, just Vermont, with 2 women from the literacy center and a rented cottage near a lake. But to Eleanor, it felt radical. She had not taken a holiday for pleasure in decades. She walked by the water in the mornings, bought maple candy for Sophie, and sat on a porch one afternoon doing absolutely nothing except listening to wind in the trees. No bills, no sons, no kitchen waiting. When she came home, she looked at the blue house on Hawthorne Lane and felt not trapped by it, but returned to by choice. That summer, she used savings Richard had once assumed would eventually drift into inheritance to create a small scholarship fund in Daniel Whitmore's name. The fund helped 2 local single mothers pay for vocational certification. When Clara asked whether she was sure she wanted to commit that much money, Eleanor smiled. I spent half my life keeping people afloat. I may as well choose the direction now. By the beginning of autumn, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt claimed in a different sense, not by ownership documents alone, but by atmosphere. There was laughter in the workshop. Basil and tomatoes grew behind the fence in raised beds Clara helped build. Sophie's drawings hung on the mudroom wall. Evan, sober and exhausted from apprenticeship work, had started fixing small things around the literacy center on weekends without being asked. Even the old porch seemed to carry itself more proudly. One evening in October, Eleanor stood in the reading garden behind the house when children's voices floated through the workshop window. Clara came out carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You seem happy," Clara said. Eleanor looked toward the house, then up at the darkening sky above the trees. "No," she answered after a pause, and Clara turned in mild surprise. Then Eleanor smiled, gently, almost with wonder at her own accuracy. Not happy, reclaimed. The years that followed did not heal everything at once. Eleanor knew better than to expect that. Some wounds closed neatly, others left tenderness behind, and some only stopped aching when life grew fuller around them. By the time she turned 76, Hawthorne Lane no longer carried the same tension it once had. The blue house still stood at the end of the street with its white trim and its creaking porch, but it no longer felt like a place being silently measured by greedy eyes. It had become something else entirely, something calmer, warmer, and unexpectedly useful to people beyond the Whitmore name. The Harbor Room, as Sophie had first christened Daniel's old workshop, grew into a small local treasure. Children came there after school to read on beanbags beneath the cream-painted shelves. Women from the literacy center sometimes gathered at the kitchen table before moving into the workshop for lessons or quiet conversation. On rainy afternoons, Eleanor could sit in the doorway with a cardigan around her shoulders and listen to life happening inside the space that had once smelled only of sawdust and old tools. It pleased her more deeply than she could have explained to anyone. She was older now, undeniably so. Her hands shook sometimes when she buttoned her blouse. Her doctor had adjusted her medication twice that year. Stares became negotiations instead of habits. But emotionally, she was steadier than she had been in decades. Once, nearly all her energy had gone into surviving, then into motherhood, then into managing the disappointment of what motherhood had become. Now, for the first time since Daniel died, her days contained room for peace that did not have to be earned by suffering first. Clara remained beside her, not as a replacement daughter, and never as some sentimental fantasy, but as what life had unexpectedly provided, a real companion in the later stretch of her years. Their affection rested on something sturdier than declarations. Clara drove when Eleanor no longer liked night roads. Eleanor helped Sophie study for school exams and listened to her first broken-hearted tears over a cruel classmate as if they were matters of world significance. At Christmas, they no longer talked about who belonged at the table. They simply set more plates. Richard returned first. Not fully, not dramatically, and certainly not in a way that erased what had happened, but life had begun to shave away the polish he had mistaken for character. A scandal at his firm did not destroy his career, but it damaged him. Not because he had committed fraud or anything criminal, but because a merger he had spent months steering collapsed publicly, and with it went the partnership he had assumed was already his. Men like Richard did not unravel loudly. They thinned around the edges. Confidence became sharper, then brittle.
He showed up one November afternoon in a dark coat and without warning, older in the face than Eleanor remembered from only months earlier. She opened the door, took one look at him, and knew immediately that he had not come to argue. "Are you going to let me in?" he asked. "It depends," Eleanor answered. "Have you come as my son or as a legal strategy?" He gave the smallest, most exhausted smile. "I don't think I have the energy for strategy today." She stepped aside. They sat in the kitchen with tea between them and rain streaking the windows. For a few minutes they spoke only of practical things: the weather, Boston traffic, Marianne's mother recovering from surgery. It was Richard who broke first, not with tears but with honesty he had postponed too long. "I was angry with you," he said, looking at the tea he had barely touched. "But the truth is, I was angrier that you saw through me." Eleanor said nothing. He rubbed his thumb against the rim of the mug. "I kept telling myself I was being responsible, efficient. I thought if I handled everything before it became a problem, then that was leadership, that was care." He exhaled softly. "But I wasn't taking care of you. I was trying to control uncertainty."
"That sounds familiar," Eleanor said. He nodded. "I know." Outside, a car door shut somewhere up the street. The clock in the hallway marked the hour. Richard's face, which had once seemed carved out of certainty, now looked like a man finally tiring of his own defenses. "I built my whole life around not becoming weak," he said, "and somehow I ended up becoming cold instead." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She could still see the solemn boy who had once promised to get a scholarship so he would not make life harder. She could still see the teenager who had stood at the kitchen table at midnight, watching her sort unpaid bills with swollen eyes. That boy had not vanished. He had simply armored himself until even love had trouble reaching in. "You wanted the house because you thought it proved something," she said quietly. He gave a rueful nod. "That I mattered, that all the years of striving turned into something solid. And now?" Richard swallowed. "Now I think I was asking brick and wood to do the work character should have done." That answer did not fix everything. It did not restore trust in one afternoon. But it was the first true thing he had offered her in years. Eleanor folded her hands. "You are still my son, but let me be plain, Richard. Being welcomed back into my life is not the same as being restored to what you lost." "I know," he said, and this time she believed him. Thomas came later, after life humbled him in a more visible, less elegant way. His contracting business collapsed completely the following spring. The lawsuit that had once threatened him ended in a settlement that cost him nearly everything he had managed to hang on to. The truck he loved had to be sold. His wife, Joanne, left for 4 months with their daughter and stayed with her sister until he stopped drinking long enough to have a coherent conversation. He moved from a house he had been proud to own into a narrow rental apartment above a hardware store. The fall from self-importance was not symbolic for Thomas. It was concrete, humiliating, and public. When he appeared at Hawthorne Lane again, he was carrying no toolbox, no rolled-up plans, no forced swagger. He stood at the porch with his hands shoved into the pockets of a plain jacket, as if uncertain he had the right to knock. Eleanor opened the door before he could change his mind. He glanced around the porch and said, almost awkwardly, "The railing looks good. Clara repainted it. Try to recover from the shock." The corner of his mouth twitched. That was how they began. Inside, he remained standing until she pointed at a chair. Even then, he sat like a man bracing for judgment. His face had weathered more in the past 2 years than in the decade before them. "I should have come sooner," he said. "You didn't." "No." They let the silence hold a moment. Finally, Thomas looked up. "I've spent a long time being angry at the wrong people. That is a common male hobby," Eleanor replied dryly. A rough laugh escaped him, brief but genuine. Then his expression broke again into seriousness. "I was angry at you because I didn't want to look at myself. I told myself I deserved that house because I'd put work into it, but the truth is, I was desperate. I thought if I could get one thing to stay mine, maybe the rest of my life wouldn't feel like it was falling apart." Eleanor leaned back and studied him. With Thomas, words had always mattered less than what they cost him to say. This was costing him. "You know what your problem was?" she asked. He looked almost relieved to be spoken to plainly. "Probably more than one. You confused effort with entitlement. They are not the same. A man can spend all day hammering at a wall and still not own the house." Thomas nodded slowly. Then, after a pause that seemed to scrape through his pride on the way out, he said, "I'm sorry, Ma."
It was not polished, it was not lawyerly, it was not accompanied by excuses. It landed in the room with the simple weight of something overdue. Eleanor looked down at her hands before answering. "I accept that," she said. "But acceptance is not erasure." "I know." "Good, because if we go forward honestly." That day did not end in embrace or sentiment. Instead, it ended with Eleanor sending him home with leftover stew and the phone number of a contractor at the Literacy Center who needed dependable workers for repair projects. Thomas took both. Sometimes grace looked more like a referral than forgiveness. The deepest change came through Evan, though it arrived slowly enough that neither of them trusted it at first. The apprenticeship he had once resisted became the making of him. Working as an electrician required punctuality, precision, and responsibility, 3 qualities Evan had spent most of his adult life circling but never sustaining. The first year was brutal. He came home exhausted, sunburned in summer, stiff with cold in winter, hands nicked and blackened, temper short from learning discipline later than most men. More than once, Eleanor heard him pacing his room at night, muttering frustrations to himself. More than once, she expected him to quit. He did not. Perhaps because there was nowhere softer to fall this time. Perhaps because age had finally made drift feel less romantic and more embarrassing. Or perhaps because losing the imagined future of the house forced him to build a real one instead. By the time he turned 45, he had steady work, decent wages, and a modest apartment he paid for without borrowing from anyone. He no longer arrived at Eleanor's kitchen as a son with a duffel bag and a crisis. He came with groceries, or with an extra loaf of bread from the bakery near his job, or to help install lights at the harbor room without making himself the story of it. One Saturday in early autumn, Eleanor found him in the reading garden adjusting a loose outdoor lantern while Sophie, now a teenager and taller every season, held the ladder steady. "Don't wobble," he told her. "You're the one wobbling," Sophie shot back. "I'm not wobbling, I'm concentrating." "That's just old man wobbling with confidence." Eleanor stood at the back door listening to them bicker and felt a strange tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with illness. Evan glanced down, saw her watching, and smiled. An ordinary smile, not the charming, apologetic one he used to wield in need of rescue. This smile belonged to a man who had begun, at last, to stand upright inside his own life. That evening, after Sophie went home to finish homework and Clara left a casserole in the oven before heading to a late shift at the clinic, Evan sat with Eleanor on the porch as dusk settled over Hawthorne Lane. He cleared his throat. "I got a raise." She turned to him. "You say that like it surprised you." "It did." "Why?" He shrugged. "Part of me still expects someone to realize I'm me and take everything back." Eleanor gave a soft sound that might have been pity or amusement.
That is called conscience, Evan. It arrived late, but I'm glad to see it. He laughed, then grew serious. I need to say something. That usually means I won't enjoy it. No, it's... He rubbed his palms on his jeans, a gesture she remembered from his school recital days. You were right. She waited. About the house. About all of it. I thought because I loved you, that meant I should never have to struggle away from you. But love isn't the same as leaning. He looked out at the street. I didn't know how much I was still asking you to carry. Eleanor stared at him for a moment before looking away before the tears in her eyes could embarrass either of them. I am proud of you, she said at last. He swallowed hard. For finally growing up in middle age? For learning to stand, she answered. Some people never do. The years narrowed after that, as years do for the old. Eleanor's health declined more visibly once she reached 78. There were more appointments, more afternoons of rest, more moments when Clara quietly took over what Eleanor no longer had the strength to do. Richard visited twice a month from Boston now, not always comfortably, but sincerely. Thomas came on Sundays when he could, sometimes fixing a cabinet or bringing flowers from Joanne, who had cautiously returned after he had proved he could remain sober and employed. Evan became the most dependable in practical ways, handling electrical issues at the harbor room, driving Eleanor to appointments when Clara worked, shoveling snow before dawn in winter. No one spoke of inheritance anymore. That silence, earned the hard way, became one of the gentlest changes of all. In late February, with snow gathered in soft banks along the fence and the sky the color of worn linen, Eleanor knew her body was nearing its end. She did not announce it dramatically, she simply seemed to understand. She moved through the house more slowly, touching objects with the quiet attention of someone already beginning to say goodbye. Daniel's mug, the hallway wall where the boys' heights had once been marked, the cream-painted shelves in the harbor room, the garden gate Clara had repaired the year before. One evening, she asked for everyone. Not a formal summons, just dinner. Clara made chicken and rice soup, Sophie baked biscuits, badly and proudly. Richard arrived from Boston, still in work shoes. Thomas came carrying groceries no one had asked for. Evan lit the lamps in the harbor room before joining them at the table. The meal was simple, almost ordinary, which was exactly how Eleanor wanted it. At one point, Sophie laughed so hard at one of Thomas's stories that she nearly spilled her tea. Richard actually smiled. Evan passed bread without anyone asking. Clara moved around the kitchen with quiet ease. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, very still, watching the people before her and understanding that this table, this peace, this lack of grasping, was the true victory. Not revenge, not punishment, order, truth, a life set right before it ended. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared and the house had gone soft with evening, she asked her sons to walk with her into the reading garden. It was cold, but not bitter. Snow glimmered under the porch light. The three men stood with her behind the house, beneath the sign that read "The Harbor Room," and beside the bare winter beds that would green again in spring. Eleanor looked at them one by one. You thought I gave this house away because I stopped loving you, she said. None of them interrupted. I didn't. I gave it where it could do the most good, and I did it because if I had handed it to any of you then, I would have fed the worst thing in each of you. Richard lowered his eyes. Thomas breathed out slowly into the cold. Evan's face tightened. Eleanor continued. This house was never the real inheritance. Not the wood, not the land, not the value. I built all of you inside these walls. What you do with yourselves after me, that is what remains. Richard spoke first, voice rougher than usual. I understand that now. Thomas nodded. Me too. Evan said nothing. He just stepped closer and took her hand. Eleanor squeezed it once. She died peacefully 3 days later in her own bedroom, with Clara at one side, Evan on the other, and the winter light just beginning to enter through the curtains. The funeral was held a week later. People came not only because Eleanor Whitmore had been a mother, widow, and longtime resident of Hawthorne Lane, but because she had become something larger than private family history. Women from the Literacy Center came carrying flowers. Children from the Harbor Room made drawings and tucked them near framed photographs. One of the mothers, whose tuition had been helped by Daniel's scholarship fund, stood weeping quietly by the back pew. The house had reached beyond blood, and through that, Eleanor had too. After the service, Richard, Thomas, and Evan stood together in the reading garden behind the house, while guests drifted in and out carrying condolences, casseroles, and coats dusted with late-season snow. None of the brothers spoke for a while. They did not need to. Finally, Richard looked toward the blue house and said, almost to himself, she knew exactly what she was doing.
Thomas let out a breath. Yeah. Evan's eyes stayed fixed on the Harbor Room sign. She saved herself first. And us after, Richard said. No one argued. Clara and Sophie kept the house, just as Eleanor had arranged, but they did not keep it as a private prize. In the months that followed, the Harbor Room expanded into a permanent community reading house. The front parlor became a quiet tutoring space. The kitchen hosted literacy meetings and scholarship interviews. A brass plaque was placed near the workshop door with a simple inscription, "The Whitmore Room," in honor of Eleanor and Daniel Whitmore, who built a home and then taught others what one truly means. The sons came and went, each carrying grief in his own imperfect way. Richard donated legal services to the scholarship fund. Thomas repaired benches and shelving without charging $1. Evan handled every wire, lantern, and broken switch in the place, as if keeping the lights on were now a kind of prayer. None of them ever carried keys to that house again. But in time, they carried something heavier and more valuable: humility, regret, memory, and the hard-earned chance to become better men than the ones who had once stood in their mother's living room and tried to divide her life before it was over.